Record. Good. So let's see what the standard has for us as far as relying on the work of internal auditor is concerned. So the standard is saying that yes, internal auditor's work can be relied upon, but only if it meets the external auditor's requirements. So the basic issue here is the same as using the work of any other expert, right? You cannot just rely on their work, but you must decide whether it is actually suitable for you, right? Although the work of the internal audit may be used for the purposes of the external audit, it is important to note that the external auditor has the sole responsibility for their audit opinion. You just don't rely on any work from the internal auditor. You have to assess it before you can use their work. If you assess it and it meets your criteria, then you can go ahead and use it. But know that at the end of the day, you have sole responsibility for whatever opinion you are given. You can't refer to the internal auditor's work in your opinion or even in your audit report. No, unless you are modifying your audit report, your opinion. So in many instances, the work of the external and internal auditors overlap, especially when it's a financial statement audit, because audit is audit. Whether it's an internal audit or external audit, it's audit. You are evaluating what? The financial records to see if it gives a true and fair view. So audit is audit, being it internal or external. So the work overlap, especially if it's financial statement audit. So external auditors may be able to reduce the amount of testing and checking by relying on the work of the internal auditor. And note that the internal auditor, as an employee of the firm that you're auditing, they are with the firm 24 hours and they are auditing every day. That's what they do. That's their work. Every day they are auditing. Sometimes they even do pre-audits so that before the transaction will be approved, it has to be audited by the internal auditor. They go to the extent of doing all these. So they do a lot of auditing. Meanwhile, the external auditor will come to the firm and spend just about 2-3 weeks. What at all can you do? The internal auditor has been with this firm every day. If they are indeed independent and objective, they've been with this firm every day and they are auditing every other day. So what will prevent you from sort of relying on one or two things that they did so that you wouldn't be repeating the work and all that? Right? However, reliance on internal auditors' work should lead to more efficient and cost-effective audits. But as I was saying, however, sometimes it's difficult to rely on their work. Okay, difficult. And as we've already said, that at the external auditor, you're responsible for your opinion on the financials, even if you relied on their work. So the responsibility of relying on the work of the internal auditor lies solely on you, the external auditor. You must therefore be very satisfied that you can rely on their work before you do so. So you have to decide whether or not you will rely on the work of the internal auditor. And this standard ISA 610 has given you guidance on the extent to which you can rely on the work of the internal auditor. How do you go about it? What should you look out for if you want to rely on the work of the internal auditor? The standard has given you guidance. So that's what we're going to learn. So what's the objective of the auditor? Is to determine whether internal auditor's work can be used at all. You have to determine this. And if the work can be used, in which areas and to what extent. So that's the objective of this standard. Whether the work is adequate for the purpose of the external audit. How will you know if the work that the internal auditor has done is adequate for you? Which work of the internal auditor can you use? Can you rely on so that you wouldn't repeat it? And to what extent can you rely on the work of the internal auditor? This standard is going to guide you. And also to determine whether such work is adequate for your purpose, and then the external auditor is required to evaluate the internal audit function as a whole and their procedures and all that before you use them. And the decision can be taken as to whether the work of the internal auditors can be used as part of the evidence of which the external auditor will be used, okay, to reach their conclusion for their opinion. You just don't rely on their work. You have to assess the internal audit function. Before you rely on the work of the internal auditor, you have to assess the internal audit function. So first, find out is the internal audit unit's objective. Internal audit department, the whole unit, are they objective? Do they have the technical competence as an internal audit function? Do they conduct their work with a professional due care? That the internal audit unit apply a systematic and disciplined approach, including quality control procedures? Do they have all these in place? You have to assess all of it. Let's look at the objectivity in detail. To determine whether the internal audit unit is objective, you have to look at their status in the organization. Who employed the internal auditor or the internal audit staff? Who employed them? Is it the management or those charged with governance? Is their employment, their recruitment process overseen by those charged with governance, or is just done by management? So that speaks a lot. It speaks volumes. If the board of directors or those charged with governance are directly involved in their recruitment process, then it should tell you that they are likely to be objective. They are likely to be objective. So that's one thing you should know. Conflicting responsibilities, that the internal auditor have other responsibilities that affect their objectives. Somebody told me that they are involved in the management of the firm. It is wrong. If they are really involved in the management of the firm, then this is conflicting with their responsibility as an auditor. You shouldn't be part of management, no. So if they have any conflicting responsibilities, then you shouldn't rely on their work. If they don't have any conflicting responsibilities, then why not you can rely on their work? Employment decision overseen by those charged with governance. Who do they report to? Do they report to management or they report to those charged with governance? All these are questions you should ask. If they report to those charged with governance, if their employment is overseen by those charged with governance, then they are likely to be objective. Constraints and restrictions. Is the internal audit function restricted from communicating findings to the external auditor? Are they constrained from communicating with the external auditor? Are they constrained from sharing their findings with the external auditor? If yes, then you don't have to rely on their work. Membership of a professional body. Are the internal auditors members of a relevant professional body? Are the internal auditors qualified accountants? Are they qualified auditors? Especially the head of the internal audit unit. Is the person a qualified accountant, qualified auditor? You know what a qualified accountant is and you know what a qualified auditor is. If you are a qualified accountant, it doesn't automatically make you an auditor. You and I know how you get qualified according to the Companies Act, how you get qualified to be an auditor. Can you tell me who is a qualified auditor? Who is a qualified auditor according to the law? Who is a qualified auditor? First and foremost, you should be a qualified accountant, right? And you should have a license to operate. And you shouldn't be disqualified. It disqualifies you to be an auditor. You should be a qualified auditor. And do you belong to any professional body? Do you belong in Ghana? Do you belong to ICA? Do you belong to the IAA, Internal Audit Agency? Do you belong to anybody at all or not? If you belong to a professional body, then you are likely to be what? Objective. But if you don't, then there's a problem. At least the head of the internal audit unit should belong to a professional body, should be a qualified accountant and a qualified auditor, and should belong to a professional body. Okay, in that case, you can say that he will make sure that the right thing is done within the unit, right? Assessing, so that's about the objectivity. You have to, these are the benchmarks, right? To assess the objectivity of the internal auditing. These are the benchmarks. So take note of that. These are the benchmarks. Now let's look at competence, assessing the competence of the internal audit unit. Assessing the competence. So you look at the level of resources related to the size and nature of their operations. Do they have enough resources in terms of human resources? Do they have enough human resources? What's the size of the internal audit unit compared to the size of the entire organization, the various branches here and there? Do they have established policies of hiring, training, and assigning internal auditors to engagement? Do they have any laid down policies? These are the questions you ask. Do they have training? Do they train their members from time to time? Periodic trainings for their members? Do they have anything like that? How do they assign members to engagement? Do they have a laid down procedure? Do they look at the expertise of the members before assigning them? How do they do it? So you have to assess all of these. Internal auditors, do they have adequate technical training and proficiency in auditing? Or they are just there? Do they just employ anybody to work in the internal audit units? Do they employ qualified people who have adequate auditing knowledge and experience? Do they have training for these internal auditors on a timely basis? Do the internal auditors possess required financial reporting knowledge? I've told you that if you don't know accounting, you cannot be an auditor, because as an auditor, you virtually be marking, evaluating the work of the accountant. So the internal auditor should have financial reporting knowledge and various necessary skills, right, to enable them audit the work that the accountants has done. Are these internal auditors members of relevant professional bodies? So all of these speaks for the competence of the internal auditor. So if you have yes for all these questions that I'm asking, then you are likely to be competent. Now, assessing the systematic and disciplined approach. Do they have a document? Have they documented the internal audit procedures, including the covering areas such as risk assessment, work program, documentation report? Do they have any laid down procedures for these areas? If yes, then they are likely and they are passing for the systematic and disciplined approach. Do they have any manual that guides their work? Do they have any quality control procedures in place that guides them? If yes, then it means that they have a systematic and disciplined approach. So if the internal auditor pass objectivity, or the internal audit unit, they pass objectivity, they pass competence, and then they pass systematic and disciplined approach, then you can rely on their work. But if they pass two and they fail one, you can't rely on their work. If they fail two and they pass one, you can't rely on their work. Before you can rely on their work, they should pass all three according to ISA 610. So if they lack any of the above, that's objectivity, competence, and systematic discipline approach, then none of its work can be relied upon. If they lack just one, then you can't rely on their work. They should pass all of them. They should have all of them in place before you can rely on their work. Is that fine? I need to charge the battery. Okay. So further consideration must be given to effective communication. The internal audit unit allowed to effectively communicate with the external auditors. If they are not allowed, then they are failed. So you can't rely on their work. Okay, so in view of that, you can ask these questions. Is internal audit free to communicate with external auditors? Are meetings held at appropriate intervals? Are the external auditors advised of and have access to internal audit reports? Are the external auditors informed of any significant matters that came to the attention of the internal audit unit whilst auditing? And do the external auditors inform internal audits of any significant matters that may affect the internal audit work? So if yes to these questions, then it means that they pass communication. But if it's a no, then it means they have failed communication. So that's one thing. Apart from the three, the objectivity, competence, and systematic approach, you also have to check communication. So if they also pass, as far as communication is concerned, then it means that you can go ahead and rely on their work. In addition to the general assessment of the internal audit units, the standard also requires external auditor to evaluate each specific work. So apart from assessing these major areas, you also have to evaluate that piece of work that you want to rely on. You have to evaluate. Just don't accept any work that they have done because they have passed the test up there. You just don't take their work and then you use. No, you have to assess each piece of work that the internal auditor has done. All right. So take note of that. So determining the nature and extent of work that can be used. So the standard has list examples of work that the external auditor can use. Examples of the work of the internal auditor that the external auditor can use. So I'm going to give them to you. According to the standard, testing of the operating effectiveness of controls, you can rely on the internal auditor when it comes to testing the effectiveness of internal controls. You can rely on the auditor. You can also rely on the auditor for substantive procedures involving limited judgment. So if you are going to use the work of the internal auditor, it should be that which requires limited judgment. Observation of inventory count, you can rely on the internal auditor. Tracing transaction through financial reporting information system, you can rely on the internal auditor because they are with the firm every day and that's what they are doing on a daily basis. So you can rely on them. And then testing of compliance with regulatory requirements. When you go to some firms, the internal audit unit oversees compliance as well. But when you go to the relatively bigger firms, compliance is a separate unit. And internal audit is also a separate unit. We have head of compliance with 8 members. And then we also have the head of internal audit unit with 8 members. But then when you go to a smaller firm, the internal auditor doubles as what? The compliance manager. So you can rely on them for compliance with regulatory requirements. When you go to organization, they are afraid of the internal auditors. So, they see them as auditors. But for some, if the internal audit unit is not strong, they don't just take them for granted, right? But when you go to organization where the internal audit units they are strong, they really regard them. And in some circumstances, audits or reviews of the financial information of subsidiaries that are not significant components of the group, you can rely on the work of the internal audit unit. So I can ask you this in exam. Under what circumstance will the external auditor rely on the work of the internal auditor? Okay, or what works of the internal auditor can the external auditor use? To what extent? Like I asked you some of these questions, so take notes. The standard has also given you work that cannot be relied on. And it virtually says that any work that involves significant judgment, any work that involves significant judgment, you can't rely on the work of the internal auditor. If the work rate involves significant judgment, then the external auditor cannot use it. Cannot use the work of internal auditor that involves significant judgment. Examples of those are listed here. Assessing risks of material misstatements. No, you cannot rely on the internal auditor. Do it yourself. Evaluating the sufficiency of tests performed. No, don't rely on the internal auditor. Do it yourself. Evaluating the appropriateness of management use of going concern. No, do it yourself. Evaluating significant accounting estimates. Do it yourself. Use your own judgment. Evaluating the adequacy of disclosures in the financial statement and other matters affecting the report. Don't rely on the work of the internal auditor. Again, I can ask you these questions on the circumstances under which you cannot rely on the work of the internal auditor. I can equally ask you, so take notes. Direct assistance and ethical issue. Can the internal auditor directly assist the external auditors? Is it possible? Is it allowed? And the internal auditors directly assist them. I've seen why, please. Where is the why coming from? Why they cannot rely on them? Are you referring to the previous slide? The person who said why, please. Are you referring to this? Why they can, okay. That's what the standard is saying. ISA system has listed, they've listed some works that you cannot rely on. The reason being that among these, there is the use of what? Significant judgment. Remember, whatever conclusion you are going to reach, an opinion you are going to give, you actually have the sole responsibility. So if the work involves significant judgment, would you want to rely on someone else's work other than your own? Remember, if it involves significant judgment, the probability that it's going to affect the final conclusion and then the opinion you give is very high. So why don't you do it that yourself? It's like delegating sort of. Would you want to delegate everything? Remember, you are responsible, so you should be careful, right? You're relying on the work of others. Some of them you have to do it yourself. Is that okay? Assessing risks of material misstatements is very crucial in auditing. Why would you leave that one to the internal auditor? You and I know that these internal auditors, their objectivity and independence is really questionable. It's problematic, right? But they are right there with the client. I mean, familiarity. They are so familiar with them. We cry worry, right? You want to rely on them for material misstatements? No. So because it involves significant judgment, that's why you don't rely on them. Are you okay? The person who has the question. Are you fine, my friend? All right. So I was talking about direct assistant. Can the internal auditor directly assist the external? After all, they are all auditors. Can he directly assist the external auditor? It is possible that members of the internal audit team will provide direct assistance to the external auditor. That they will perform procedures on the external auditor's behalf. It is permissible in line with ISA system. According to the standard, it is permissible, it's allowed. However, it must be considered whether these internal auditors meet the independent requirements which apply to external auditors. In practice, it appears unlikely that many internal auditors would meet these requirements, right? But I can assure you that in practice, it happens. It happens in practice sometimes when the external auditor realizes that the internal auditor is good. Probably he's even coming from, a big four auditing firm, or he's coming from a renowned auditing firm. Maybe he was pushed from an auditing firm. They rely on their work. They use their direct assistant. They ask them to assist them. Madam, is it in theory or in practice that internal auditors are not part of management? Are you learned internal auditor last semester? Weren't you told that they are auditors? Internal auditors are auditors. They are supposed to assess the work of management. So how can they be part of management? What were you told last semester? Internal auditors are never ever part of management. They are not supposed to be part of management. They are not supposed to be part of management. Hmm? They are not supposed to practice. And then when you go to the field now, but they are not supposed to be part of management. They are supposed to be independent. They're supposed to be independent, right? That's the only one. Okay. So getting back to a direct assistant, I was telling you that in practice, most I wouldn't say most, let me say some external auditors use the direct assistance of internal auditors. When they realize that you are good, you are coach, you are coming from a good, highly recognized auditing firm, so you are good. Why not? And if you happen to be free at the time that there's no auditors around, they will use you a lot. But before you do that, there are certain ethical conditions that you should meet. Okay, you have to obtain written confirmation from the individual and from an authorized representative of the client entity that the individual will follow the audit firm's instructions and observe confidentiality, and also confirm the role that the individual will play in the responsibility of the external auditor for quality assurance and audit opinion. So the bottom line is you have to obtain written representation from the client, the company that you're auditing, that they are releasing this person to help you provide direct assistance to you. But in reality, which external auditor will do that? Or request? In reality, which external auditor will do that? In reality, they don't do it. They don't go to this extent, but they actually use them. That's what I can tell you. But according to the standard, this is what you're supposed to do. If you want to use their service, obtain written representation from the client's management that they should release this person to you, and this person they should follow this, that they should be confidential. Anything they see during the external audit, they shouldn't disclose it to the firm that they work for. Can you imagine? And as you supervise, review, and evaluate the work that they perform, you ensure that individuals are not involved in working um on work that involve a significant amount of what the work that they did. Otherwise, it will lead to a self-review threat and all that. You also have to communicate details of the arrangement with those charged with government. The board of directors should know that hey, you are actually needing the assistance of some of the internal auditors, blah 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 blah. Nobody do that in reality, right? But the law allows it, the standard allows it, but in reality, they don't go through these formalities, but they actually use them and tell you. So that's about direct assistance. Steps when relying on the internal audit to work. One, you have to discuss the planned use of their work with the internal audit units. At the beginning of the audit, at your planning stage, communicate to the internal audit unit that you intend to use their work this year. So, right? Quarterly, they actually prepare quarterly reports, internal audit reports, and all that. So, quarterly reports should be made available to you. You can even give them areas that they should audit. If you really intend to use their work, communicate to them the areas that they should focus on and all that. You can do that and they will just do justice. You also have to read the relevant internal audit reports to understand the nature and extent of audit procedure that they perform and then their findings. That quarterly report that they prepare, you have to get access to them and then read it even before you come to the field. Before you go to the client's office, you should get those reports and be reading them. And you should carry out and document sufficient audit procedures on the internal audit work to be used to assess its adequacy. Whatever work that they've done, you also have to carry out sufficient audit procedures on them to see if it's adequate for your purpose. You can rely on them. Remember, I told you that every piece of work that you want to rely on, you have to test it before. So that's step 3. So it may be useful for the external auditor to agree on the following in advance: the timing of such work, the extent of the audit coverage, materiality and performance materiality, methods of item selection, documentation of work performed, review and reporting procedure. You can agree with them as far as these are concerned, so that they will consider all of these when they are working, so that their work will be useful to you, right? If you indeed you really want to use their work, then communicate all of this to them in time so that their work will be useful to you. So agreeing such matters in advance will make it more likely that the external auditor will be able to rely on their work. Otherwise, everything they do will be unuseful to you, right? But as external auditor, you are required to evaluate and perform audit procedures in order to determine the adequacy of the work that the internal auditor has done, whether the work was performed by internal auditors with adequate technical training and proficiency, whether the work was properly supervised, reviewed, and documented, whether adequate audit evidence was obtained to allow internal auditors to draw a reasonable conclusion, or whether appropriate conclusions were reached that's consistent with the report that they prepared, and any exceptions or unusual matters, whether they were properly resolved by the internal auditor. So you also look out for these things before you rely on the work of the internal auditors. So procedures to achieve this will depend on the external auditor's assessment of the risk of material misstatement of the areas concerned, right? You have to examine items, already examine how do you evaluate the work that internal auditor has done. Examine item that has already been examined by the internal auditor to see if you get the same results. They said they tested this, and this what they found. Go and do the same thing, get the underlying records and also test it yourself to see if you get a result that they thought. You can also examine similar items, right? You can also observe procedures performed by the internal auditors. When you finally go to the field, you can be observing how the internal auditors they do their work. Just be observing them. It will give you a lot of evidence as to whether you can rely on their work. When the external auditors come to the field, I always tell my students, everything they are doing, they are gathering evidence, even if you think they are just chatting with you or gather evidence. When they are just sitting down quietly looking at you, they are observing, they are gathering evidence. So auditors, anything they are doing, they can just go for lunch with you. They just say, oh, can we go for lunch? And now gather evidence. And we just they are all evidence gathering. So you have to be careful. It's our friendly. So if he happens to be chatting with you here and there, he's gathering evidence for information. You're not that friendly as you may think. Documentation of the work. The standard requires the external auditor to document conclusions about the evaluation of the adequacy of the work of the internal auditors. And any audit procedures performed by the external auditor on that work, you have to document it. I hope you know that documentation is key. At the end of the day, you will not be taking the decision for the final opinion and all that. You don't do that at the end of the day. So you have to document whatever evidence that you gather, so that whoever will be taking the decision in future will get enough what basis for their conclusion. So that's internal ISA system. Any question for Beatrice? Any question for Frank? Any question?
No, madam.